What's at stake in Iran's presidential elections? Iranians are choosing a successor to the late Ebrahim Raisi. But with the supreme leader wielding enormous power, how much difference would a new president make? And how's this vote viewed both regionally and globally? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Following the sudden death of President Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash last month, voters in Iran are now choosing his successor. The Guardian Council initially approved 6 male candidates from a pool of 80. They include 1 reformist and 5 conservatives. But some dropped out. With the nation facing political unrest, economic challenges and tension with the West over the nuclear program, the stakes are high, and potential conflict between Israel and Lebanon further increases its significance. So what path might the country take after the vote? What might be the outcome for Iran and for the world? We'll discuss all of this shortly. But first, this report by Axel Zaimovic.
Inflation at record levels and widespread shortages of essential goods. After years of sanctions imposed by the US and EU, Iranians are choosing a new president a month after the death of Ebrahim Raisi. But many say they have little hope of meaningful change.
I am not going to vote because presidents can't do anything. They don't have the authority to do anything for people, and life is very expensive.
An estimated 61 million people are eligible to vote, and the Supreme Council is calling for high participation. But with discontent growing, the declined turnout in previous elections suggests fewer Iranians are doing so. Many blame corruption, a lack of real choice of candidates, and the burden of sanctions.
One of the ways or channels through which the sanctions negatively affect Iranian economy is through amplifying corruption and rent-seeking activities. We are observing the barriers for international trade, the devaluation of Iranian currency. The government needs to rationing the available resources for imports, and some of these goods receive the subsidized rate and some not, and that provide an ample of opportunities for the rent seeker to engage in the trade, misinvoicing and illicit trade and smuggling.
A new president will also have to deal with heightened regional tensions over Israel's war on Gaza, the war in Yemen, and strained relations with the West over its nuclear program. 6 candidates were vetted and approved by the Supreme Guardian Council. Of the 3 frontrunners, 1 is a reformist and the other 2 conservatives. They are Saeed Jalili, a former chief nuclear negotiator and secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, and Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament since 2020, who previously served as Tehran's mayor and police chief. Masoud Pezeshkian is backed by several reformist groups, as well as former presidents Mohammad and Hassan Rouhani.
With a reformist president, we might be seeing more efforts to engage with Western countries, particularly the European ones. But I'm not sure, this can be successful because the failure of the nuclear deal.
The president is only the second most powerful person in Iran, behind the supreme leader. But the post carries significant authority within the executive power that many Iranians will be hoping the new president will exercise to bring change to their lives and their country. Axel Zaimovic, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our panel of experts to explain the significance of these elections. We have joining us from Tehran, Hassan Ahmadian. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Middle East Strategic Studies. In Washington, D.C., Ali Vaez, project director on Iran at the International Crisis Group and a former senior political affairs officer at the United Nations. And joining us from Beirut is Sami. He's the director of the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs. Welcome to Inside Story, everyone. Let me start with Hassan in Tehran then. So how representative, first of all, are these elections when the list of candidates have been whittled down from 80 to just 6?
Yeah, well, there have been all sorts of arguments on that. You see, the bar is so low, anyone can basically run for president, but then the vetting process brings the number down. It has been the case for over 4 decades, and the Guardian Council usually is tasked basically with the vetting process that brings up the main candidates or contenders for the president. Now, the main numbers, I mean, the real, names.
But Hassan, let me jump in. Even former presidents, senior figures were barred from running this time. Why?
Well, each one, we basically don't know exactly. You see, the Guardian Council is not transparent in how it does vet candidates. And we don't exactly know why and how it is vetting them. But according to reports, it's basically there are 12 members. They bring up the person, his resume, and basically what he does basically in his current position, and then they hold a vote. According to reports, Larijani, for instance, got 5 votes basically proving him, and 7 opposing, and so he was not qualified. And I think others also are vetted the same way. So it's not clear cut as to why each and every candidate is qualified or disqualified. We know that the body basically holds a vote, and then each candidate is either qualified or disqualified.
They make their decision. All right, Sami Nadir, will this, do you think, impact voter turnout? What are your expectations?
According to what we're seeing and what we're following, the main challenge is to have a high turnout, or a turnout that is acceptable or that is in line with international standard. But according of what we are following from the news, that the turnout that is expected doesn't seem to meet those standards, maybe because a large share of the Iranian population has lost trust in the system that is in place.
But what will that mean, Sami? I mean, if this turns out to be another low turnout after the low turnout in March parliamentary elections of around 41%, and let's not forget, a record low turnout in the history of presidential elections in Iran in the last presidential election in 2021, which was only 48.8%.
Because for the last 40 years, and despite the fact that there were elections that were taking place, and sometimes these elections brought in a new elite in power, but this failed short of changing anything that pertains to the general policy. And the fact is that at the end of the day, the one that makes the real decision is the person that is at the head of the pyramid, which is the supreme guy that is taking finally the whole decision, relying on the Republican Guard that are the main instrument controlling the system.
Talking about the head of the pyramid, let's take the question now to Ali in Washington, D.C. Do we see a clear front runner when you look at the polls? Well, they're not always all reliable, are they? Some have placed Pezeshkian sometimes in first or second place, but they're all kind of, the top 3 candidates are all kind of close, between 20 to 25%.
They are, absolutely. They're still within the margin of error from one another. There was an expectation that some of the conservative candidates would drop out so that their vote doesn't break down. And if indeed Mr. Jalili or Mr. Ghalibaf would withdraw in favor of one another, their odds of getting through the first round of elections, getting over 50% of the vote, would increase significantly. But these two individuals are old conservative rivals, and it does not appear likely that they would compromise. They didn't 11 years ago in another presidential elections in 2013 that led to the upset victory of pragmatist President Hassan Rouhani. So we'll have to see. Two conservative candidates dropped out today, Mr. Zakani and in fact yesterday, Mr. Ghazizadeh. But they were polling pretty low, so I don't expect that to make a major difference. And Mr. Pezeshkian, in case that neither of the two conservative candidates drop out, will likely go to a second round runoff on July 5th with one of these two conservative candidates. And that can create a really polarized situation in which participation could change and, in fact, increase.
That's an interesting prediction, Sami. Now, that if this does go to a second round, what will that mean in terms of the chances of the lone reformer versus the conservatives? What does it mean for their chances? What does it mean for the region, do you think, as the region watches this?
I mean, what it means for the region, it means a lot, because at the end of the day, what is at stake is the line the new president will take, bearing in mind that when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to Iranian behavior in the region, that this is something that is in the hand of the Supreme Guide, as mentioned. But definitely the impact of the election, just in the case where a reformer or the candidate that represent to change will make it to the end, this will ease, in my view, the tense situation that is seen in countries like Lebanon and like in Iraq, especially that this will have an impact on a swath of the population that are not in favor of the line.
And Sami, does it going to a second round, do you agree with those analysts who say going to a second round might help a reformist candidate?
It will create a dynamic, and this dynamic can turn or can impact hidden dynamic in these countries. When, for instance, a demonstration took place in Iran lately, this had a huge impact on the youth in this country. We've seen a campaign of support in some Lebanese universities supporting the case of this student who were beaten to death. So in case that there is a sign that change is possible, I think that this will trigger a parallel dynamic in those society.
All right, we'll pick up more. There's lots more to talk about in terms of the region as well as global implications. But before we do that, I want to go back to Hassan in Tehran and talk a little bit about economy. What's at stake here? How different are the economic policies of the candidates when it comes to issues like inflation, unemployment and so on, the things that really bite at people's pocketbooks?
Well, it's the main challenge that whomever is elected moving forward is going to face. Their debates showed that the main concern and the main basically issue that was debated and different programs were brought up by the candidates were focused on economy, which is basically reflective of what the society is concerned with. The candidates know that it's the economy that attracts people and voters to them, and they put forth their agenda, economic agenda. We are witnessing a split between two camps, basically, when it comes to economic relief and, tackling the economic challenges. One that focuses on capacity building within, which belongs mainly to the conservative candidates, a continuation of the Raisi administration policies, And another one, which was brought up by Pourmohammadi and mainly Pezeshkian, who says basically we cannot do much without a parallel track and foreign policy dealing with global powers, specifically on the nuclear issue, to ease the impact of sanctions. These two, arguments were made, and I think the Pezeshkian and reformist camp linking the economics to foreign policy has seen previously have been very much resonating within the society. We shouldn't forget that President Rouhani linked the two and he got the vote. And I think Pezeshkian did the same, though the polls don't show that much of resonance within the society. But I think that linkage is critical in the minds of many Iranians. And if, as Ali mentioned, the elections...
Hang on, Hassan, you said the polls don't show much resonance. But could it be argued that the reason we sometimes see Pezeshkian in first or second place in the polls is precisely because the public are hoping that his, shall we say, softer position on relations with the West might translate into an easing of sanctions and better economic times for Iranians?
Of course, but 11 years ago when Rouhani made the case, he got huge support by the voter turnout, and he was elected in the first round of the elections. But the polls don't show that trend in this elections. Maybe if we move to a second round with Pezeshkian against one of the conservative contenders, polarization might lead to more connection in the minds of Iranians between the economics and foreign policy. And that's basically what the reformists are banking on, I think.
All right, so we've got to keep an eye on whether this goes and how quickly it goes to another round. Ali, whenever we talk about the economy, of course, we got to mention the big question: can it be turned around without dealing with the issue of sanctions, which means dealing with the issue of the Iran nuclear file and how that is perceived by the West?
Yeah, look, it's very interesting because in 2021, when President Raisi came to office, I think the regime's general perception was that with a real belief and focus on an economy of resistance, which primarily relies on Iran's internal capabilities, and also pivoting to the East and doing more trade with Russia and China and Iran's immediate neighbors, they would be able to turn the economy around. And especially because all instruments of power were also controlled by conservatives, so expectation was that with lower friction, there would be more efficiency in the system. All of those plans turned out to be an absolute illusion. And the Iranian economy is now in more trouble than it has ever been before. And the Iranian people, as a result of it, are suffering. And there's a lot of socioeconomic discontent in the country. In this election, two out of the three main candidates, Mr. Pezeshkian and Mr. Ghalibaf, have admitted that sanctions relief is an essential part of any plans for turning the economy around. Mr. Jalili, the ultra-right candidate, is still in denial and still believes in continuation of the same approach that in the Raisi administration did not bear fruit. The problem is Mr. Pezeshkian, although he's surrounded by the creme de la creme of Iranian diplomats, has not put forward any practical plans on how he wants to tackle the diplomatic challenge of resolving the nuclear standoff with the West. And Mr. Ghalibaf has put forward a very narrow plan, which is based on a series of step-by-step measures that at best could provide Iran with some degree of short-term economic reprieve. It's certainly not a long-term solution to Iran's economic challenges. And of course, Mr. Ghalibaf is bogged down with all sorts of allegations of corruption, which would, again, cast a shadow on his presidency if he is
corruption, Ali, is a big issue, isn't it? Can any of the candidates make a difference on that malaise, you could say, the other great malaise that's eating at the Iranian economy, briefly?
I'm cynical because that kind of really real fight with corruption requires the kind of structural changes that are very unlikely in the Iranian system, especially if you have a split between the government and unelected institutions. If the government is in the hands of the reformists and conservatives control unelected institutions, it reduces the chances of success.
All right, before I go to Sami, I want to ask this question since we kind of veered into the issue of relations with the West. When you look at what the candidates have been saying on that issue, well, Jalili has been talking about how Iran doesn't need really relations with the US and the West. Pezeshkian, on the other hand, well, he's spoken against the idea of Iran being perpetually in a state of hostile relations with the US. How much variance can these candidates actually bring to the table when it comes to actually policy and real relationships with the US and the West?
In terms of foreign policy, we know that the macro strategies are set on a consensual basis in the Supreme National Security Council. But the administration plays a key role in foreign policy in that the president and a number of his ministers will be members after being elected and appointed members of the Supreme National Security Council. So they can block or they can further their agenda. When it comes to foreign policy, the priorities are usually set by the administration. They basically are the ones who focus on either, say, Rouhani focused on negotiations with the P5+1, Raisi focused on the move to the east and the region. So the administration has a lot to do with foreign policy, though there are guardrails. They should observe that is the consensual mechanism within the Supreme National Security Council that they can affect eventually.
So it's a question of degree, perhaps. Sami Nader, another way of looking at this, Sami, might be, does the relationship maybe have as much or even more to do with who wins that other big race going on in the world, the race for the White House?
Definitely. I think that this is the elephant in the room, and this is the next election that will impact this one or the result of the Iranian election. Will Trump be the winner or Biden be the winner? If Biden will be the winner, there is a great chance that things will go to the negotiation table. And in my view, there are high chances that an agreement on the JCPOA or the nuclear file will be reached. Actually, negotiations are still taking place between the two parts. But what if, and this is very likely today, according to polls, if Trump win the presidency, knowing that Trump withdrew from its commitment from the JCPOA and canceled the agreement. And this will, in my view, squander any chances of normalization between the US and Iran.
Very briefly, Ali, how realistic is it to think that there could be a return to an Iran nuclear deal, even if Biden wins the race to the White House again?
I don't think it's realistic anymore. The facts on the ground have changed so much that the 2015 deal no longer responds to the requirements of either side. Iran's nuclear program is now too advanced to be rolled back and put in a box with short-term constraints and transparency measures that would be satisfying to the West or Israel. And there's a 20-year track record of the West failing to provide Iran with effective and sustainable sanctions relief. So there is a need for a new kind of deal with Iran, which no longer includes the P5+1, because even that power balance no longer exists because of differences between the Russians and the Chinese on the one hand and the West.
Right. Sorry to rush you, but I'll try and get in a couple more questions before time runs out. Back to Sami, you mentioned the conflicts. What's at stake here for some of the regional hotspots, whether we're talking about Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen? If we look at some of the opening statements, the opening parliamentary session in April had Mohammad Ghalibaf praise Iran's support for the axis of resistance, whereas Pezeshkian's foreign policy advisor, Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister, warning in his memoirs against intervention by the Revolutionary Guards in Iranian foreign policy. There does seem to be some difference between the positions of these candidates when it comes to foreign policy, particularly regional issues, right?
Definitely, there is a difference. If a conservative wins, that means that the current policy will still in place, and Iran will be backing organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah at the detriment of its relationship with Arab governments, practically almost all Arab government, maybe with the exception of Syria today. And this despite the recent opening up of Iran to these countries, because this kind of policy is perceived very negatively by those governments. They are seeing an attempt from Iran to establish in the region that they consider as very strategic as for them.
Yeah, all right. A quick question for Hassan in Tehran. What difference do the candidates bring to the relationship between the president and the supreme leader, and how much power does the president really have?
Well, it's perceived that the conservative candidates are closer in their worldview to the supreme leader, though the supreme leader has worked with people from across the spectrum over the decades. The difference that
but he's appointed people like Saeed Jalili to several positions, whereas he made comments about counting on progress coming from the US, which was seen as undermining Masoud Pezeshkian's position, right?
Well, that's one argument, but also he appointed Ali Shamkhani, a reformist, as the head of the Supreme National Security Council. Before that, Ali Larijani. So he worked with people from across the spectrum and different administrations, though, as I said, he's believed to be closer in his worldview to the conservative camp. But the president brings change to the country in that he runs the main branch of government in Iran. He manages the economics, the social life, and in foreign policy, as I said, he's effective. So the change can happen whether it's a conservative or a reformist.
All right, well, I guess time is going to tell. We're going to have to thank our guests and leave it there. Hassan Ahmadian, Ali Vaez, and Sami Nadir. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.